Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to PERVADE in conversation with Dr. Alex Hanna. I'm Jessica Vitek. I'm an associate professor in the I School at the University of Maryland and one of 7 researchers and PIs on the PERVADE project. So PERVADE, if you're not familiar with it, stands for Pervasive Data Ethics for Computational Research. And it's a 6-institution research project focused on answering empirical questions in data ethics. Funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation, we are studying how people react to their pervasive digital data being used in research, how data scientists are grappling with ethical questions in their work, and how regulators such as university IRB boards, institutional review boards, are guiding data-intensive research. This webinar series, which is ongoing throughout 2022, is highlighting a number of researchers doing cutting-edge research in data science, artificial intelligence, and data ethics. So today I am very excited to be joined by Dr. Alex Hanna. Dr. Hanna has a PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is currently the director of research at the Distributed AI Research Institute, or DAIR. Her work centers on the data used in new computational technologies and the ways in which these data exacerbate racial, gender, and class inequality. She's a co-chair of Sociologists for Trans Justice, a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Transgender Studies, and sits on the advisory board for the Human Rights Data Analysis Group and the Scholars Council for the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. Alex, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Jessica.
You're very welcome. So, folks, as we are going through this conversation, it is a conversation, and Alex and I will be doing a lot of talking. Hopefully, Alex will be doing most of the talking, but we welcome you to join in at any point by using the Q&A feature in the webinar. So if you have any questions, comments related to today's session, feel free to drop one in and I will try to intersperse them, or if we have time at the end, we will go through those. So, Alex, we wanted to talk to you today specifically because you've been studying ethical AI for several years now, notably as a senior research scientist at Google, and now, as I mentioned, your role as director of research at DAIR. So to kick things off, can you talk a little bit about your role at DAIR and DAIR's goals?
Sure, no, absolutely. And I can say a little bit about the way that DAIR was born. DAIR was born sort of out of a, very, visible crisis when it came to the ethical AI team at Google. And after both the co-leads of the ethical AI team, Timmy Jabiru and Meg Mitchell, were fired. And so then 1 year after DAIR was announced by Timmy, and it was something that we had been talking about for about a year soon after that emerged. And so the idea behind DAIR is, there's to have a kind of a different mode of AI research. And we have this really peculiar kind of starting point where we don't really, AI is in the name, but we're not really starting from AI. AI is not inevitable. It's not this sort of magic, and it sort of obfuscates many things, in fact, to talk about AI, and several other people have made the point that AI is not really even kind of a coherent set of technologies, but rather it's sort of, or at least the way it's used right now. And so we start from the point of DAIR as being a place where communities that are affected by AI are the people that we start from, and are the groups that we start from. And then it kind of has a threefold goal. So starting and working with communities that are affected by AI and different kinds of data-driven technologies and automated decision-making systems, mitigating and finding ways to mitigate harms that come out of those systems, and then looking for ways in which we can build tools that are empowering people that may have been traditionally overlooked. So my role at DAIR is Director of Research and sort of have my hand in everything, have my hand in prioritizing what our research agendas are, working with our researchers and our fellows as a way of developing kind of and enriching their research agendas and putting them in conversation from the larger ecosystem of what we call ethical AI. Are you muted?
I know. It was bound to happen. I didn't think quite this early. So, I mean, I really like this kind of reframing of thinking about problems associated with AI that DAIR is taking. And like you said, rather than treating AI as inevitable or here's a problem, how can we throw, AI to fix it? It's starting from this position with thinking about the communities that are affected. So I really appreciate, more of a focus on identifying harms and conducting embedded community research to people most affected by it. So, for yourself, not necessarily like from DAIR's perspective, but for yourself, like why are these values so important when you're doing AI research?
Yeah, I mean, for myself, it's important because I think when you're starting and thinking about AI research, I mean, I'm starting from a position of sort of thinking about, I'm a sociologist by training. One of the reasons I got into sociology was to understand and mitigate inequality in different kinds of ways, be that racial, class, and inequalities that are outcomes of sort of settler colonialism and these divisions between the global north and global south. And so starting from that position is thinking about, it reframes the way that we start thinking about socio-technical systems. And so AI, more generally, or the way that we do AI research now, at least in the way that it's been adopted by large corporations and AI-centric startups, has been really gathering as much data as possible, kind of come what may, without kind of concern for rights of data subjects, about consent, about all these different kinds of problems that we know are involved in that. And so that turns it on its head to really start thinking about, all right, if we're starting to think about AI from the perspective of, the society that has deeply unjust and unequal outcomes, then what does it even mean to be developing technology or mitigating technology, knowing that that technology is supercharging those inequalities? So personally, it means, it's definitely a big value shift coming from some place like Google, which is, kind of at the place where the Google frame is AI is sort of inevitable and it has this huge amount of power and it's going to be deployed. And we need to, mitigate these, these biases that are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and whatnot. And instead saying, all right, we don't want to start from there because we don't even want to start from talking about this kind of technology that's being developed as part of a large suite of products that are having continual releases. We need to slow down and really start to think about what does it mean to start with people who are already having their life chances and their livelihoods worsened by these technologies. And so that kind of starts itself from a point of doing some kind of mitigation, but also trying to reimagine what these technologies will look like.
Yeah, it also seems to be a direct response and critique of how the tech sector, Silicon Valley, is often been characterized. Move fast and break things, which I often saw as like, let's just roll things out to get out there first, and we can see after the fact if anything bad happens, which seems like a horrible approach to technology design.
So, right? Why are we doing this? Well, I mean, we know why they're doing it. I mean, it's because it's very profitable right now, but yeah, that's the way that it's been going.
Yeah. I mean, even with that, though, it has been interesting in the last, I don't know, 5 years or so to see an increase in interest. And we can debate how deep that interest is, whether it's, just a surface level to check a box, but more conversations happening about ethics in AI, and from people who are not folks like yourself, or the PERVADE team, who that's like core to our research. And most notably, we can see this in the creation of the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency, or FACT, that launched in 2018, and that's now an annual conference, much like other ACM SIG-Chi conferences. So I'm curious about your kind of thoughts on this shift, and whether you think that this is a good thing, and whether it's whether you think this is just that box checking, or if we need to do something more radical to get researchers to seriously start thinking about these topics.
No, for sure. And stepping back and starting to think about the development of FACT, and as well as AIES, the AI Ethics and Society Conference, which has been a triple AI conference. Thinking about the history of FACT, FACT started as FAT, and then it was kind of just FAIR ML. So it started as sort of series of workshops that would have happened at different ACM conferences. There was some kind of people that were pushing that initially. Salon Baracos, Moritz Harks, and a few folks like that. And one level, it's a welcome intervention. And then on another level, it also has pretty clear limits, right? And so a lot of folks have made this sort of this criticism of fairness as a field. And I want to sort of go into this just for folks on the call. This kind of development of this conference, I think, started initially very much, I think, as a bit of a technical intervention. Some of these, the initial papers in this field, kind of the initial equality of opportunity paper, the initial demographic parity paper, these papers that were trying to impose fairness constraints on some kind of a decision-making system that had some kind of sensitive attributes. And so many of these became very much technical problems as things that were kind of interesting from a technical level, but then had ostensibly admirable social goals. And so I think, that was certainly sort of, if we were going to periodize sort of FACT, this is a very stylized sort of history, that was, I'd say, the early times. There became to be more of an imminent critique within FACT, especially kind of at the turn of 2019 and 2020. And people have written a lot of things. Anna Lauren Hoffman's paper, Where Fairness Fails, is very illustrative of that. Jared Mulligan's paper, this thing called Fairness, about kind of how fairness itself is this, what she calls an essentially contested concept. And many other folks, especially from civil society and computer science, are very, from civil society and non-computer science fields, typically the social sciences and humanities, were very critical of this kind of idea of having this kind of fair type of algorithm, right? And making it just sort of a technical thing. And, from within that frame, we also saw recently there's papers at FACT this year. I think there was two. One was actually kind of a meta-analysis of FACT paper. I haven't read these in full, but I know they are in existence. But one was a meta paper on FACT. And then another paper was called, I think, The Corporate Capture of FACT. It was written by Meg Young, Mike Cattell, and Keith Craft, which took a much more critical take on FACT as a venue in a conference. That, I think, is the most full-throated critique of the FACT project. And a lot of that actually stemmed from organizing efforts that they and a few other folks have, and I'm one of the signatories to this letter that they posed to the executive committee of FACT, which was primarily identifying the corporate capture of FACT as being a place where companies can go and say they're doing things that are ethical, say that they're doing things that are fair, that they're addressing bias in products, they're publishing papers in the domain. And also was a peak criticism of a particular paper which was written by written in collaboration with a hiring company, Pymetrics, that was using some of these, and they were kind of advertising their fact paper as being proof that they had a fair product, and there was a very peak criticism of that there, that they were kind of using it as this check mark. And so I think that's the real, that's one of the real dangers in this kind of idea, that there's some kind of a certification, that could be a check mark, that this is certified fair. And I've had a lot of conversations with people. One of them is Seda Versus, who has talked a little bit about how there's kind of a way in which this has happened with privacy too, where privacy is saying, okay, we've applied, differential privacy, check, that's done. We don't need to address this in any of the other ways. We don't need any, robust privacy legislation. We don't need anything that really addresses these different ways privacy are manifest. We just have done enough anonymization across some kind of subclass that, we're not going to de-anonymize somebody in a kind of a public serving API. But that's not really the point on many of these privacy issues. Privacy itself is more complex than that. And so, yeah, so it's I don't think it's a bad thing that FACT has emerged, but also given that it kind of sits within the realm within the ACM, it's also, it's one kind of element of intervention that, and it's a double-edged sword too, because at one level, some people are already saying FACT has kind of veered too much out of the non-technical, whereas other people have sort of said that FACT is not radical enough, and I'm in the second camp personally, but also knowing that kind of it's a field level problem with computer science and software development and technology development.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway from this, and I say this as a social scientist also by training, but to me, this kind of development that you described just highlights how important it is for social scientists, critical scholars, STS scholars to be part of these conversations about technologies. And I really hope that kind of one of the larger scale outcomes of this and similar conferences is we recognize the importance that, when you just have an engineering team work on this without any training and without outside of conversation with anybody else, these types of problems are more likely to emerge. And there are multiple ways of addressing that, but bringing in these, people with other disciplinary training is just so critical in these conversations. You can't, mathematically create fairness by itself. There's too many other factors, I think, involved. So, I completely agree with you. I worry about this kind of we built this model and it says, our technology is fair. So like you said, that's enough. So
yeah.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Are there either topics or papers, stuff that you're working on or that you're reading that you're really excited about, things that have been coming out recently?
Yeah, it's what a good question. So I will, I can talk a little bit about some of the work that I'll just gas her up because I'm on her dissertation committee, but Mila Gross-Maselli, who is defending her dissertation next month, has been doing a lot of great work. She's a fellow at DAIR. And she's been recently, her dissertation is all about this kind of idea of truth and power with data annotators. And so Mila's dissertation is really cool because a lot of these papers are already out, so you can read them. So it's and then one of them is coming out pretty soon. Is on kind of like the field. The understanding of this is we have this sort of newish. It's not like completely new. I mean, we have a lot of echoes of other, these elements of BPOs, business process outsourcing, but this kind of process of taking data that's central to AI and, having people typically in the global south doing annotations, and these can usually it's image annotations or it's upper language annotations. And so Mila's field sites are one in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, that's where she's originally from, as well as in Bulgaria, in which many of the annotators are from the Arab world, are either in Syria. Most of them, I think, are in Syria or are Syrian refugees. And so they're doing this work as, in a way, and it's typically research data that's used in AI. And so a few of her papers look at, there's some work that she's done doing interviews with the kind of the AI experts and also the managers in these BPOs, but then also with the workers in the BPO in these organizations, and doing workshops with them as well as kind of co-designing in that. And so one of the papers focuses on the kind of power differentials between managers and workers in the organization, and the inability of really changing unclear aspects of instructions, how a lot of these don't really make sense. There's also work where there's a co-design workshop that she held with workers in Argentina and in Bulgaria. And then there's another paper that she recently published with Julian Posada on where they were doing a kind of a what they call a dispositive analysis, or kind of a discourse analysis of the different instructions, the actual annotation of instruction, and finding kind of the unclarity of those and the inability to really change those if they don't make sense. And you can kind of pair Mila's work with Julian Posada's work in that field. He was recently interviewed, for instance, he and Mila were recently interviewed in MIT Tech Review by Karen Howe in their AI colonialism series, talking about this kind of way in which, there's a way in which these companies, and especially these kind of companies like Appen or the many ones that are specialized in data annotation, are outsourcing these, and especially looking for places that are in crisis. So that looks like Venezuela, where there's been mass inflation, but also Kenya, places where Syrian refugees have fled, etc. And so I found that to be a really kind of amazing kind of line of inquiry. I think this is definitely one in which, which we're kind of seeing these kind of elements of colonialism extend. And we even talked a little bit about that. We had a workshop, and we've talked about what would it even mean to sort of put a value on how much the labor done by these very poorly paid data annotators is actually worth. How much would it cost when you saw how much money goes into Tesla's self-driving program, or Waymo, or any of the, or Cruise, or any of the self-driving, where the instructions have to be so meticulously annotated, but at the end of the pipeline, it's sort of so poorly, they're so poorly paid. So that's one area that I've been really excited about, and more in the headspace of really thinking about. Also, our other fellow, one of our other fellows at DAIR, such as Salfala, has been doing work on using computer vision to detect neighborhood change in South Africa. And sort of her work has been focusing on this really careful stewarding of aerial images of differences in South African neighborhoods. And post-apartheid, and just a little background about this because I didn't really know this so recently either, but post-apartheid in South Africa, many of the laws, the kind of passbooks were outlawed that would allow Black, colored, and Indian people to travel to primarily Afrikaner white neighborhoods. Those are outlawed. There was some economic restitution, not but there was no land redistribution, and so any kind of desegregation of those neighborhoods has been very, very, very slow. And there hasn't been government programs that have been extensive enough to do that redistribution. And so what this thing that Rasuch has been doing, Rasuch is someone who's grew up in a township, one of these segregated townships, is to work with other folks who are also from townships and annotating these to actually see these differences between these neighborhoods, the wealthy suburbs, and also the non-wealthy townships, and understanding how these are shifting over time and using computer vision to actually map that across time. And so her and Dylan Baker, also at DAIR, have been working on some visualizations and some tools to show that. So this has been some exciting stuff coming out of DAIR, just to say what a lot of stuff that we're working on. And I mean, it's going to be stuff we're working on for a bit more on a long-term basis as well.
Two things I love about those two examples: one, junior scholars and you hyping up their research, which I think is so important. And two, both of them are dealing with the global South, which is often ignored in technology research in general, let alone when we're having these bigger conversations, but they are also affected by all of these advances. So I really appreciate that you raised those two folks up with your comments.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and I mean, I think that's that's one thing that that's sort of a priority in DARE, given that it's a kind of a very very distributed team. I'm in California, but then most of the other people that we talk to are on the African continent or in Europe or or in the diaspora. And so yeah, and that's another kind of problem with fairness, right? Talking about the fairness conversation, either one is sort of basing fairness constraints off of a misreading of US anti-discrimination law, without also acknowledging the limits of those laws themselves. And that's something that Anna goes into in her article as well. And or it's based completely in a kind of a GDPR world, Eurozone kind of situation where we're focusing on GDPR, and it's constrained only to people think GDPR is the bee's knees, and all they talk about is the lack of enforcement without really thinking about the limitations of GDPR and the ways that corporations have actually accommodated much of GDPR as well. And so, yeah, meanwhile, it becomes the global South is this world of extraction, the place where, mimics this kind of colonialism. I think the colonialist metaphor still very much holds in this case, as a place where, people's labor knowledges, are extracted without proper remuneration, proper compensation. Let's try that one. And it's also done in a way, but that's like not even some of the point. The point is, these organizations are set up so there's no really agency that can be manifest from that either.
Yes, since you were talking about DAIR specifically, I want to jump to one of the questions from the audience. So Katie asks, it strikes me that DAIR's approach is unusual in its assumption that AI is not inevitable. Are there other models from other technology resistance movements that the organization is inspired by? And what are the practices or interventions that can make a difference in this specific technological trajectory?
Wow, what a great question, Katie. I thank you for that. And I think talking about kind of partner or co-conspirators of this, the kinds of orgs or the kinds of people that we talk with and that we're in community with we talk a bit with Algorithmic Justice League, sort of as a means of sort of thinking about what some of the resistance looks like, not necessarily starting with particular algorithms, but thinking much more about governance. We're also kind of friends with our Data Bodies project and the kind of network of collaborators that have stemmed out of that, between Sita and Tawana Petty, and other folks that have involved in that space. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those two projects, especially our Data Bodies, kind of start from a kind of community orientation, thinking much more about organizations or starting with organizations and individuals who are subject to, what they see as massive data surveillance, massive, kind of massive decisions being made on their behalf without any input. And meanwhile, what does it mean to sort of turn that a bit on its head and sort of think about, well, these are sort of ways of interrogating these algorithms, rather than starting from a place that starts with the algorithm or starts with the technology. And so, we take a lot of inspiration from them, and are in community with those folks.
Yeah, so I think this is a nice connection here. So the PERVADE project's been around for 5 years. All the PIs have been doing research before then. So we've been studying a lot of these questions for a long time. And one of our main things is capturing perspectives from various stakeholders. And one of the kind of overarching findings across studying different stakeholders has been that power and justice are key concerns, both for the people who are affected by data collection, as well as the researchers gathering and using that data. So for yourself, for DAIR as an organization, how do you all think about power and justice in your research?
Oh, yeah, I mean, what a huge question, right? I mean, for me, I think the way that we think about power and justice is thinking about who has control over this research, knowing that research itself is a form of power, and being able to research something, especially from a place of privilege, living, if we're like focusing on these things in the global south, I mean, where are people actually living and being attentive to? So I'm like not in these places I've mentioned. Some people are, and the people that we work with, if we have a collaborator on a project, we're saying, well, if we're going to do a project about South Africa, if we're going to do a project about Argentina, do we have people who are in those places? Do we have people who have experienced those harms? Do we have people who are actively organizing against those harms? Okay, can we bring them in? Can we support them? And so, I think it's very much sort of challenging this idea of, when we think about power, it's often thinking about, well, at least I start with, and something I strive for DARE to also strive for is, well, who is this research accountable to? and who are we in community with. And so if there's no kind of actionable mechanism for research about, X for people who are affected by X to be to hold people who are writing up that research to be accountable to them, then that's, we haven't done what we think is sort of a, due diligence about it. And this is more about being reflexive about the power we have as researchers, as being, a nonprofit that is, has a lot less money than your Google or your OpenAI, but is, still on the whole, has a lot of symbolic power, and it has a lot of economic power in those different ways. And so, that's one way we think about power from our own kind of reflexive perspective. There's the other aspect about it is like, how do we think about power as terms of how do we think about what's our theory of change, right? And that's a bit of a harder question to drop there, right? Because it's sort of there's such a challenging and overwhelming sort of I don't necessarily want to call them foes, because that's maybe I'll call them foes. No, I want to be that oppositional. I will be that oppositional. So we have such looming foes. What does it mean for this small, scrappy group of people to come together and sort of challenge those? And so, the kind of things that I think we can have, the sort of what we've seen in different kinds of guises is that there are ways in which, developing research or coming up with novel insights can pose a challenge, can act in a way that does give some kind of, can influence policy, can influence civil society in a way that can be positive, given, and of course this has its limitations. I mean, it's not like you're going to pass anything in today's Congress or anything, but it does have some kind of premise in which that, that research needs to happen prior to basically anything else. It needs to exist. We need to target that. We need to develop those kinds of repertoires as a means of articulating what these problems are, and also pointing ways forward. So I think that's sort of, one thing that we, another kind of the other side of power, the kind of power we have to challenge. And I think the more and more we work at it, the more and more we'll have probably a better articulated theory of change. And I wish I had like a more optimistic answer. I'm not a very optimistic person, but like
I mean, I'm a privacy scholar. It's hard to be optimistic in this space. Right. So my follow-up to what you just talked about aligns well with something Michael had brought up in the Q&A. So I was going to ask basically, and maybe this is a very easy question to answer, about kind of like what is preventing the big tech companies from being more reflexive, from engaging in some of these processes that DAIR is doing as part of their research. And Michael brought up related to reflexivity and power. Can you offer any suggestions, maybe from your experience at Google, on how we can better train computational researchers to gain that reflexive stance?
Yeah, okay, so great questions. Kind of two questions. I'll take the first one, which is sort of what's preventing your Googles and your Microsofts from doing quote unquote the right thing, right? And I mean, the short answer to that is money. But the longer answer to that is kind of governance, and there's not anything that really compels large companies to sort of do the necessary due diligence on ensuring that their algorithms aren't going to do the racist or sexist or XYZ thing, right? Example, so at kind of like at Google, we try to develop some internal guidelines about what to do about basically any kind of annotation of gender internally, and wrote up a very large, long document. I mean, large for an internal document. It was like 30 pages long. It's not actually large for a CSCW paper, but or a law review paper, but was effectively saying, well, gender is not binary. You can't assess anybody according to visual inspection. These things that lots of research has shown, working class Charmin among them, and so these are things, and so that typically what happens is that internally, and I don't think this is a super secret because this happens externally too. They'll say something of the nature, well, we acknowledge that gender is not binary, but gender is binary in terms of how we're assessing this, because it's sort of it's easiest to do to work with technically from a kind of a binary classification, and we need to do some kind of a fairness assessment. And Michael Ekstrand and I have been doing kind of a survey of recommender system papers to basically find that much of the time this is sort of the way that's talked about, if they acknowledge that gender is non-binary, is not non-binary at all. And so kind of the short of it, to kind of land this plane, it's very sort of expensive to do those mitigations, and there's not a lot of incentive to do that internally because there's not kind of a united way of reining these things in. And so on the off, it's more sort of, it's cheaper on the whole to sort of do this mitigation once there's a press blow up or something, because kind of on balance, it doesn't really affect their bottom line. There doesn't seem to be any huge dips in stock price when these things happen. And so that's sort of the big impediment there. There's just, you don't put a lot of money towards it. So yeah, and so that's sort of the institutional basis. The question about education is a good one, and also one that I am a bit pessimistic on. but that's not helpful to Michael, who has to do a bunch of training of junior technologists and many other folks in PERVADE. And so, I think, if there's a way to sort of, I don't necessarily think this happens at the syllabus level, right? Like, I think there needs to be sort of institutional changes within universities that incentivize this kind of reflexivity and taking classes outside of computer science fields, or decenter the sort of importance of having very heightened technical acumen, which sort of what exists now. You have people who haven't been reflexive at all, and then graduate with a PhD from Stanford and go ahead to head up Tesla's AI unit or whatever, and obviously have not taken these classes or have thought very far about these things. And so yeah, so I mean, it's not like the interest isn't out there from many students. I have talked to, in the past 3 years, I will say I've talked to over 150 students that, in one-on-one contexts about, I'm really interested in ethics, I'm interested in these elements, and they're in computer science programs, and they're saying, what do I do here? I don't think this interest isn't out there. I think there's immense amounts of reflexivities, and students in undergrad and graduate programs in computer science are actually immensely reflexive, and they seek out taking classes on race, gender, on history, on the global South. It's more about what is a way to really shift it so that it's valued within these these organizations, these tech firms, or these places where students go to work. And I think that's a bigger, that's a bigger conversation. So I know that's not very satisfying as an answer for educators, but it's also, there is a huge desire out there, I do believe, but it's to, how do you make this necessary? How do you make this part and parcel? So this, there isn't this valorization of purely someone who can math good,
Yeah, it's mildly reassuring that you've talked to so many students. Pranav has a question that kind of builds on this and is related to this. So they said they would love some discussion around the ethics teams in big tech specifically, and if that tends to obfuscate those companies' role and impression for the profit motive, and relatedly, how young researchers are going to be attracted to a place that pays well, especially in comparison to academia, and allows a role that is supposed to work towards social good, but is likely never to directly challenge capitalism and only default to inclusion and diversity within existing hierarchies. So also a, not super optimistic view, but if you have any thoughts on that one. Oh, you're muted now.
This is a great question, Pranav. And I mean, I think that this is one of the criticisms that, for instance, Meg Young and others have made in the recent fact papers, sort of the corporate capture and how these things were very valorized. I mean, in the paper they criticized us very directly. We had a zine fair in 2020 at FACT and sort of said, they attacked it as sort of a way to make Google look good, which, that's fair. Like, we worked at Google, and that's a fair criticism. I'm happy to take that criticism because, it was expensive to put on and we could have never done it without that corporate support, right? And so I'm thinking, I would say that coming in, people who are working and have this reflexive view and this critical view need to come in pretty clear-eyed about what the limitations of that are. The kind of view of, I'm going to be the person who sort of changes everything from the inside. That's not super realistic. But there is sort of an inside outside dynamic that exists within this. And someone, I am also like a scholar of social movements, and some of the research on activism within companies and kind of or against companies have shown that this kind of inside outside dynamic is helpful. So be that shareholder activism or combining employee activism or employee kind of efforts to move the needle with outside dimensions. You can kind of actually see that a little bit. I think recently, a few weeks ago, Facebook finally removed their lookalike audience tool, which a lot of people, including the team at Northeastern, Pietra, I don't know, I can't pronounce his last name, and Alan Mislev had written about this way in which these tools have perpetuated racial and sexual and gender exclusions in serving ads. And so there was actually a team within Facebook, including Miranda Bogan, who used to be at Upturn, and some of their policy people. They removed it internally and worked internally to remove that. And so this wouldn't have happened unless, there was researchers on the outside. There were calls, from many civil society organizations like Color of Change. I think the National Fair Housing Association too also filed a complaint too with I think the EEOC, I'm not sure. I'm not going to get all the organizations correct, and then they're correct, but there were people who could action upon it internally. While that was an inside outside strategy, that sort of thing where there's going to be kind of massive change purely from the inside is not, I think that's not feasible, but having both are important. Now, staying inside has its own exhausting ass problems. Excuse my French. It has its own issues and it's very tiring. And there's a lot of inertia against it. But there is sort of ways in which that can be, there could be maneuvers for that. So yeah, so like that's sort of a, probably a pretty optimistic take on that. There's definitely kind of the element of it where, ethics teams can look like a way of kind of, ethics washing internal things, but if there are ways, but if there are actual wins that are coming about and, Facebook, for as much of a terrible product it is, has some researchers that have been working on some of that in a way that have been surprising. That's a win that I've seen. Facebook also has a few kind of transparency efforts, which have been like their open transformer model. They also had a really great paper, and I say this with no irony at all, but they had a really great paper on measuring the carbon footprint of large language models and large recommender models. It's called sustainable AI, and then it had a sub, but there's a few different. I can drop the link in the chat because it's there's like a few papers with this subtitle. So but it was and it was published at an ML conference, and so oh, I didn't send that to everybody. And so and you can kind of compare this to the paper that Google put out on carbon emissions, which was terrible, just to say the least. It was really kind of greenwashing some of the results. So yeah, so that's so just to wrap up, it's sort of there's clear limits to such a position, but I think there's sort of a way in which being on those teams can be part of this inside-outside strategy of change.
Earlier brought up the challenge of governance and lack of incentives inside of these tech companies. So I have to, again, as a privacy scholar, I feel like I have to ask this question. So what role does Congress play in regulating or not regulating AI-related harms? So do you think there needs to be federal level regulations, or will that not work?
I mean, I do think there should be federal level legislation. And I mean, I think, I'm not quite sure what that looks like. I mean, I'm not a policy wonk on any regards, but some of the efforts around the Algorithmic Accountability Act, I think, was rewritten and I think I actually don't know what its status is. I don't know if it was reintroduced in committee, but it was a vast improvement of the 2019 bill. It adds a number of technologists under the FTC. It requires firms of a certain size to publish audits of all their algorithms, or many of them. And then requires them to, actually have some enforcement of it. So yeah, I think it's very much needed. I don't know what the possibilities or what the political winds say about such thing. I'm pretty pessimistic. But the funny thing about tech is that, both the left and the right sort of hate these companies. So, but for different reasons. So that might pose some kind of alliance to that end. I'd also love for them there to be, I mean, I think a GDPR style, actually, I messed that up. That kind of style legislation would be a mass improvement, since right now it's just wild west to privacy. In the past worked the legislation between, Illinois and California and, other state-based. So there's definitely a role. What does it mean? I think it's still in the mix, and I'm a little, I'm pessimistic as well, just given the amount of lobbying money in Congress right now, and the sort of even the corporate capture of places like OSTP, and there's a recent report on how much control Eric Schmidt had in that agency, and the amount of kind of power and hiring that he had done there, which makes me a bit worried as well. But there's certainly a role.
Yeah. So we're running out of time. So I figured I would end by asking you, what is the research, or what are the topics that you want to see scholars tackling in the next 3 to 5 years, let's say, when it comes to issues of fairness, accountability, transparency, AI ethics more broadly?
Yeah, what a question. I think what folks, I'll say what I am wanting to do, and it's thinking about systems more holistically, and thinking about in the field that I'm working with, thinking about data, for instance, that's used for training systems. So understanding really deeply where the data is coming from, understanding the sort of incentives and institutions that are involved in producing them, as well as how that kind of has pretty concrete effects. So I'd really love, and so that's kind of where my interest is. I'd love for this understanding of a focus on the organization to be really highlighted. I'm coming at this kind of thinking about this in the view of, needing more kind of methods and strategies from organizational sociology, thinking about how that has a pretty direct connection to how these technologies are developed, and how that plays into different choices. And so I don't think Jake's on the call, but I actually love his work on ethics owners, because I think it gets at that a bit. Elizabeth Watkins also has some work where she's done interviews with her and a collaborator who's in the streets now, did some interviews with AI developers and AI company owners, and sort of understanding these kind of mimetic processes of pushing them towards one way or another. And I think we need that more in the sort of organizations involved in the AI pipeline, and the technology pipeline. So decision makers, community members, kind of people all over, to understand what is this really from top to bottom, this understanding, this view on this kind of technology, and what does it mean to have this kind of scope broadened. So beyond just developers, but also thinking about this kind of long, broad sweep. I love folks that focus a lot more on this organizational view.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. Folks who are still on the call, look forward to the next In Conversation With, which is going to be on Monday, July 18th at 1 p.m. And we'll be talking to Amandalyn Pallotta. So I hope we all have a great day, and thank you for joining us.